Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host.
Wells.
We hope everyone had a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays. We appreciate all the recent support and viewership on our content. And before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yeah, so, obviously you're watching this on, a lovely, lovely Friday. And we had a slate of Christmas games, basically. And this might have been the best stretch of Christmas games that we've had in quite some time. I mean, it's kind of funny because we've had so much discourse, in terms of the NBA and the ratings talk and, what's wrong with the game. And we gave our thoughts on it, right, on a previous episode. So you can check that out if you want to know more about that. But the NBA needed this, right? They needed an opportunity to kind of showcase, that there's no one else that can really pull off a slate of Christmas games like the NBA. And you got the best of both worlds. Obviously, they were going up against the NFL, who also had some good viewership of their own, right? Obviously, theirs is different because theirs is streaming as opposed to being on ABC, right, which you can see on cable. But either way, I mean, what can you say? All of these games were pretty solid. I mean, there were a couple of games that weren't quite as good as some of the other ones, but by and large, every game was watchable, every game was entertaining, had some type of stakes. And that's kind of the cool thing is we've talked about it where when you have games that have these big stakes, competitive moments, we know these guys will show up and, will kind of put on, the best display that they can, right? This isn't like the All-Star game, right? This isn't, like some, random game in January. This is Christmas, so everybody's watching. And shout out to all these players. So we got 5 games. We'll start off, I think, with probably the best one, the biggest one, and that was the Lakers-Warriors game, right? This was a game, obviously a highly anticipated matchup. We've had several matchups between these two teams, and we've had several matchups between the two main characters involved, right, in LeBron and Steph. Now, the Lakers ended up pulling this off, 115 to 113, and this was kind of a wild situation because 7 minutes into the game, AD goes down. Doesn't really seem like he bumps into anybody. Just kind of seemingly just kind of walks and just hurts his ankle. And has to come out of the game. And he wasn't. I didn't really expect him to come back because it's just based off of what happened, you just weren't sure. But you might have thought maybe he might have been able to tape it up and come back in, but he wasn't able to. And this is key because in the last 2.5 games, there was a stat that basically said in the last 2.5 games the Lakers have played against the Warriors, AD's only played 15 minutes. The last few matchups they played, he either hasn't played or got hurt very early into the game and couldn't really finish it. And so this was a wild game from multiple perspectives, right? One, obviously, you had the two guys on the floor, right? Obviously with AD being out, everybody had to step up. So you had LeBron kind of setting the tone on both ends of the floor with 31 and 10, 2 of 4 from 3, 12 of 22 from the field. And then you also had Steph on the other end, right, with 38 and 6. And it's funny because from his standpoint, if you look at his stats on Christmas, for whatever reason, he has not really been, that great of a performer in Christmas games for whatever reason, right? Like we know he can play well. We know he can be great in big games. So it's probably just like a coincidence or whatever, right? But he was very good in this game and has tried to keep the Warriors, hopes alive. And this was a big game for both teams because of the fact that, in terms of the standings, right? Both teams had come off of a loss, right? The Lakers had just lost to Detroit. The Warriors had just lost to the Indiana Pacers. And both teams had been playing not amazing. Like the thing is, the Lakers prior to that Detroit loss had won like 3-4 in a row. But the Warriors have been sliding significantly since the early part of the season. But in this game, obviously you had a ton of big plays on both ends of the floor. And then from a Lakers perspective, again, with AD out, you needed everyone else to contribute, right? They've had that starting lineup or starting backcourt of Austin Reeves and Max Christie, right? Max Christie's been in there, to provide some two-way play, right, as an athletic guard that can defend and can rebound and give you some length. I mean, it's not like he was able to shut out Steph because he still, hit a big amount of his shots, but he did make him work. He made it difficult, and it helps Austin kind of maximize what you want him to do on offense. He had a 26-point triple-double, including, which we hadn't even gotten to, the game winner, right, where he has the ball, right, at the top of the three-point line, and he goes left, gets right past Wiggins. Kuminga doesn't help, right? He's kind of busy sticking with Rui. And he scores with like a second left. Steph tries to, you know, throw a full court heave after, right? This was coming off of, right, Steph hitting back to back threes to get the Warriors, right, basically to a tie game with basically 10, 12 seconds left to go. So, you know, from a Laker perspective, again, it was huge. And considering like it wasn't even just AD because there were other guys who didn't play in this game, right? D'Angelo Russell, right, was out. Um, and then also you had other guys who have not played much this season, anyways, right? Like Vanderbilt has not played a game. Christian Wood hasn't played a game. Jackson Hayes was their initial backup center, right? Instead, it's Christian Coloco, who only really played 8.5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, for most of the game, it's basically Rui at center. So even Gabe Vincent, right, ended up having some moments in this game, right? I know he didn't shoot amazing, but just by and large, just getting contributions from everybody, you know, is what you want. And it wasn't a perfect game by any means from a Lakers perspective, but you know, you got the job done. Now you're 4 games above 500. But for the Warriors, it's rough, right? Reportedly, they had a team meeting before this game, right? Because they had been sliding. You know, again, they started the season off 12-2. They're now 15-14. So since that starting point, they've been 3-12, which is just, you know, abysmal. And it hasn't gotten better. They have not been able to close games. You know, in terms of crunch time, they've not been able to get it done there. Despite Steph's best efforts, right? It's just you watch it and you can kind of see it's just you just don't have enough consistent offensive contributors outside of Steph. Wiggins was okay in this game, right? He had 21 points, 12 rebounds, 8 of 19 from the field, but you know he did his best. Draymond, good on the defensive end, right? 4 blocks, 10 rebounds, but didn't shoot the three well in this game, and he was 1 for 6 from the field. Trace Jackson Davis, right, had basically 11 and 9 with 2 blocks, right? He's been playing better as of late, right? Dennis Schroeder, you know, continuing to be the starter. Hit some threes, right? He was 3 of 10 from the field, which isn't great, but he was 3 of 6 from 3 after not really hitting any jumpers at all. In his early debuts games for the Warriors, right? Peeled only 2 for 6. Kuminga, 14.6 rebounds, minus 17 in a in a very close game in a 2-point loss. So, you know, he was good in the game against the Pacers, but he's had, you know, kind of an uneven stretch. Even had a weird quote at one point where he mentioned basically um if other players, if they went through the things that I've gone through in terms of, you know, I guess kind of being out of the lineup, not knowing your role, right? They'd have mental issues, right? They may want to quit basketball, stuff like that. I don't know. It just doesn't really feel like this team is in a good spot. Gary Payton got only played 6.5 minutes, and there were reports before we got on to record that he's going to be out at least a week with a calf strain. Not that he had been playing that great for them this season, anyways, but just in general, you know, it's just kind of a not great situation to be in. But just a story of two teams in, you know, interesting spots where it doesn't feel where they're kind of in this weird spot where, as currently constructed, they're not really good enough to win the title, but they still have guys on their team that if you can get them there, right, they can give you a shot. But it's very clear that they need to make personnel upgrades. But I don't really necessarily know if they're going to do that, right, from either team's perspective, just because of, you know, how their front offices and ownership have operated over the last few years. But regardless, you know, what a game. Because, I mean, you know, obviously you can talk more about the game as well. But just, again, two of the biggest stars in the sport coming together once again, putting on a show for everybody, and they delivered.
Yeah, I agree with you. You know, this was 100% the headliner, for sure. You know, everybody wants to tune into LeBron versus Steph, as always. You know, whether it be regular season, postseason, when, and wherever, we need to see that matchup. So, yeah, that's a good starting point. And then also, um, I think going into this game, I think both of these teams were in a very similar spot, but I think coming out of it, you feel differently about both teams. You know, I think I feel a lot better about the Lakers and what they were able to accomplish. You know, AR having a freaking monster game, triple double, like you said, game winner as well. That's just sick. And then, you know, with the Warriors, you know, you got a lot out of Steph, but not a lot out of everybody else. You know, I guess you could say you got something out of Wiggins, but you know, I think as a whole, I didn't like a lot that the Warriors were doing this game, and I think it reflects in the final score and even the box score as well. Like, you know, even like Kaminga just not really taking over, because I think, you know, this should have been a game where he could have taken over coming off the
Yeah.
bench and being in that second unit and being and taking charge. Because I know, you know, he meant, like you said, he mentioned the whole minutes thing and, you know, not really knowing your role, but if you're given 30 minutes a game, or not, a game, but 30 minutes in this game, I think you should do a little bit more than what you kind of exhibited. But that's neither here
with
nor
no
there.
center on the other team.
With no center on the other team, given his repertoire and what he's able to do on the court, you would think he would take advantage of that opportunity and not say like have an AR game, but at least try and match that intensity. But that didn't happen. So overall, though, the game was crazy, super back and forth at times, pretty much the whole game. But I think the Lakers did a great job closing, and then the game winner obviously was just insane. And to do that on Christmas Day is awesome. And I think that's something that the league needed. It just brought a certain level of excitement because everybody's already tuning in because it's LeBron versus Steph, and then for it to be so competitive and not be a wash or anything like that, and then for Reeves to have a spectacular play like that was awesome. So overall, good game. Kind of wish AD would have played, but clearly they didn't need him to take out the Warriors. And I think that's kind of where it's like you kind of have to put these teams in separate tiers, I think, because the Lakers clearly were not fully healthy, and the Warriors pretty much were. So I think you do have to kind of take that into consideration.
Yeah, and it's just again, it just kind of speaks to the wild nature of their seasons, right? Because again, like the Warriors started off so well.
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of funny because when we went into the season, I think we were in general lower on Golden State than the Lakers
Yeah.
because of the LeBron and AD factor, and where it's like if you have those two guys and then a decent performance from the supporting cast, that should probably be enough to probably get you, at least, somewhere close to the play-in. But we thought the Warriors might be really bad this season, just from the
Yeah.
perspective of, especially like if Steph were to miss significant time, they're actually 4-1 in the games he hasn't played. But I think part of that hot start was I think the schedule was pretty soft, and then also everyone on the team was playing pretty well, right? Whereas recently in the last month they've had a very brutal schedule, because in terms of like the schedule they've had, the Lakers aren't even like one of the best teams they played. Like they've played pretty much everybody. They've played Memphis, they've played Dallas. I mean they played. Well, I guess Cleveland was earlier in the season, but then the Rockets games, they lost to Denver. They've played the Clippers, they played the Suns, they played Minnesota, they played everybody. So that's kind of the tough part for them. But just in general, you just kind of wonder like, what are they going to do? Because again, we know that as currently constructed, they're just not good enough, right? And again, there were conversations, I guess, that many people had over the last few weeks, because then you look at say LeBron before he had that week off or whatever, right? He had that stretch where he wasn't playing that well, and some people were kind of wondering whether or not like, hey, is there something going on in terms of his game kind of falling off? People had those questions about Steph too, right? Where it was like he had, before coming into this game, right? He was like 2 for 13 against the Pacers, not a defensive stalwart team. And then he had, only one of the worst games of his career against Memphis, right?
Yeah.
He just chalked that one up to just a horrible game, because that's what
Mm-hmm.
happens when you lose by 50. Doesn't
Yep.
necessarily mean anything, but it's just everything went wrong for you.
Yeah.
But just in general, I don't know what they do, just because people have talked about, do they go after Jimmy Butler? And they could. It's just a matter of, is that deal going to get done? Because they're both first apron teams, right? So they'd have to move a lot of guys in that package. Do the Heat even want any of the guys that, Golden State has? Like, do they want Jonathan Kuminga, knowing that they're going to have to pay him, and extend him or whatever? I don't know. And if it's not him, who else is it? Do you go after maybe a Cam Johnson? I'm not sure, but we talked about it, where the lack of a consistent go-to guy outside of Steph is what's going to hurt them. And you
Mm-hmm.
can see it in these close games, because if Steph doesn't have it, they pretty much have no shot. And in this one, he did have it, but you still weren't able to get it done. And that's the part that's tough, right? Because like in some of these games where he didn't play well, you can kind of point to him. Not that you always want to put it on one person, but you could say like, well, he didn't play that well. And it's like, if he played better, maybe we win. But in a game like this, he gave you everything you could have asked for. And no one else really was able to kind of make up for that, unfortunately. So that's, again, this I think it's mainly that the start that they had to the season kind of gave them a cushion, where
Mm-hmm.
like they had to play awful, for them to fall all the way to 10. But I think it's very clear that how they've been playing in December, not that they're like actually like a 3-12 team or whatever, but like it's closer to probably what they actually are, right? Like a team that's probably in the lower half of the play-in unless everybody plays well. And it's just a lot of these guys don't necessarily have that track record, and you don't have another, like I said, consistent offensive guy. Like, Schroeder, I think would be better off the bench. But again, who can you argue, like, in terms of starting over him, right? Like, nobody, right? There's not really anyone else in that group where you're like, this guy has to start over Dennis. Like, maybe Buddy Hield, but I don't know. Like, other than that, like, I don't think there's like an easy fix for this one. So to me, if they want to actually be a more serious team, like, they have to make, a move, in my
Yeah,
opinion.
I agree. There's no consistency, like you said, outside of Steph, because I think you do kind of like Schroeder in there for his defense and what he's kind of able to bring alongside Steph in that aspect. But then you talk about Buddy Hield, he's pretty good offensively, but even he, it's kind of tapered off a little bit from what we saw early in the season. Not bad
Yeah.
at all. His numbers are still phenomenal for a guy who pretty much 90% of his shots are threes, but still, I think it's a double-edged sword, and I think you'd probably, I don't know, it's tough because I just don't think they have the personnel to slot anybody in there, that's significantly better than what they have, and I think that's where all this talk of trades is coming from because I think the glaring issue is you would probably want to move a guy like Kuminga because you could get some solid return for him, and help bolster up your depth or whatever, or go out and get a star like that. That's what it really comes down to. It's just a matter of there's not a lot of guys that are available that we know of. So, that's the tough part. And I think, their hands are tied. And I even think that goes for the Lakers as well. Like, I know they're talking about, getting depth and stuff like that. They're not really looking at a star. Who knows? But I think their hands are tied as well. Like, there's not a lot of guys that you would probably want to give up, that you could get like a solid return on, like for the Warriors outside of like Kuminga. I don't know.
Yeah, like say for the Lakers, Austin I think is the guy where not untouchable at all, but you would only really move him if it was like for, a star type player,
Yeah.
right? Whereas like you say if you're trying to trade for like a Cam Johnson, and they have some tough, stipulations that make it difficult. But like if they were trying to trade for him, like you wouldn't give up Austin,
Yeah.
right? But if you're not putting Austin in the deal, then other teams probably will end up having better deals unless they're
Yes.
willing to put in, those picks. And we don't, history kind of tells us that they're probably not all that willing to put in, picks unless, there's some type of home run deal. But the home run deals that they usually make, we don't know. Like they usually kind of come out of nowhere. So even like the reporting for Valanciunas, right? It's been mentioned 100 times, but it still hasn't happened yet. And it's not like they couldn't do it. So you kind of feel like at a certain point, the longer that goes on, then it's probably less likely that it'll get done. And again, like there are probably maybe more pressing needs than, to go out and get a guy like a Valanciunas for sure. It's just you just kind of wonder what their mindset is, right? Even reports from the Athletic saying that, oh, maybe now they want to keep Gabe Vincent. And it's like, okay, I mean, like if
Oh
you
boy.
want, but I mean, but I understand like from the perspective of like he's played better, but also like the other thing is because he's not an expiring contract, that's probably a guy that they would have to give up more in order to get off of his deal. And if
Yeah.
they have to give up like a first to get out of him, then they probably just wouldn't do it. But we'll see. But yeah, I think as of right now, you do probably feel better about LA. But for the Warriors, to be fair, their schedule has been very difficult, right? Like I think they can be relatively fine against bad teams, but against like clearly the best teams, that's where they, have had a problem. And it's been that way for the last couple of seasons anyways, right? Like even last season, right? It was the same thing where they couldn't really beat great teams and they couldn't close games. And they couldn't really close games the year before that either. Like when they were a playoff team, right?
Yeah.
Like when they were going against the Lakers, they couldn't close those close games and then, that kind of basically flips the series right there. So, it's been kind of the same issues for the last few years, even though they've had pieces shuffle in and out, right? Like,
Hmm.
a couple seasons ago, you had guys like Jordan Poole, right? And Klay Thompson, right? Last year you had Chris Paul. And now you don't have any of those guys, right? It's guys like Kyle Anderson, Buddy Hield, DeAnthony Melton, now Dennis Schroeder. But, again, as we already knew going into the season, both teams kind of need to do something if they want to move up into the next tier.
Yeah.
It's just the question is, whatever that is that enough to actually put you into the next tier? And that's where we'll have to see, because it is tough to pull off those type of moves later in the season and then try to make a championship level run. You may be able to make a deep run, but we just haven't seen a team be able to do that and win the title. So you're
Yeah.
already kind of in a tougher spot anyways, because ideally you want to do that stuff before the season starts.
Yeah, you're in a
Like your
big
type
hole.
of work goes. Yeah. Now we'll go into another pretty fun matchup, the Sixers and the Celtics, right? This was kind of a big game from the perspective of we hadn't seen a whole lot of Phillies, starting five together because they have barely played, right, in
Yeah.
terms of their health. Going against, who most people believe to be the best team in the NBA, and the favorites to probably win it all. And the Sixers ended up pulling it off, 118, 114. Before the game, Embiid had a thing where, he was in the shoot around and ended up hurting his ankle. And it wasn't sure whether, it wasn't clear whether or not he was going to play. He was going to try it out and see what was going to happen. And, he ended up playing and he had 27 and 9. Obviously Paul George didn't really give you a whole lot. 4 of 15, 0 of 7 from 3. Caleb Martin basically replaced his production, 23 points, 7 of 9 from 3, right? Former Celtic killer, right? We remember that postseason series, right, against the Celtics, right, where he
Mm-hmm.
was on the Heat. He just couldn't miss. But really, and then obviously off the bench, Gorshan Yabusele, right? Former Olympic guy, 12 and 4. But really the hero for the Sixers was Tyrese Maxey, who had 33 and 12. And he was actually the guy that sparked the run because the Celtics tied it up to go into the fourth quarter. And you kind of felt like, because the Sixers had been up for most of the game, and then you kind of felt like, all right, here come the Celtics. And then, Tyrese Maxey to start the fourth, neither Paul George nor Joel Embiid are in, and they make that run to basically close out the game and finish the game with both Embiid and Paul George on the bench. Because Embiid only played 30 minutes,
Yeah.
and Paul George played 33, and Maxey played 40, or
Right.
just under 41.
Right.
So that was kind of the swing point here. Obviously, prior to the game starting, Jrue Holiday didn't play. Porzingis ends up getting hurt. So we only got to see bits and pieces of what both teams looked like at, I guess close to full strength. I know Holiday was out. But, for the Sixers, this is the type of game where, you can feel good about, all right, this was your best win of the season. This was your
Yes.
best game of the season where
Yes.
you're going in, into on the road against the defending champions, and you ended up taking it to them. Again, does that mean that we're going to pick the Sixers to beat the Celtics in a 7-game series?
No.
Probably not.
No.
But, if you're the Sixers, just based off the fact that they have been playing much better recently because they've been a lot healthier. They're 7 and 3 in their last 10. So, you got to build off that, right? They're 11 and 17, so they're still 6 games below 500. But again, with the East standings, if you continue to pay attention to it, right, they're, if they can have a decent stretch of games coming up, right, where they can win these games, they can move up. So, for the Sixers, it's good to kind of see now they're starting to kind of get things back under control, which is good for them, right? Because it was looking pretty awful to begin the season.
Yeah. I mean, with the Sixers, Tyrese Maxey was the freaking Grinch. I mean, he came out of nowhere, honestly. Like, we already know that he's able to, put up these kinds of numbers, but like you said, he was the one who really, broke it open and gave Philly this, window of opportunity to take the W. So, I think you do have to, tip your hat to him. And obviously, like you said, Caleb Martin coming out of nowhere and having a crazy performance as well. That kind of gives you, I think, some reassurance where you feel a little bit better about what Philly has and what they're able to accomplish. You definitely feel better about the offseason now that these guys are, somewhat healthier. So I think you feel good about their recent stretch of games. And like you said, they could easily climb back into this thing. And I think everybody knew and predicted that that was going to happen just because of the sheer talent that they have on the team. Like, they're not going to be like, one of the worst teams in the Eastern Conference forever. It's just a matter of time before they do get healed up. So I think that's pretty special. And then from like Boston's perspective, I mean, I don't really know where to start. Like, Porzingis didn't really play a whole lot, 13 minutes. So I'm gonna defend Boston, and I think if Porzingis plays, his normal rotational minutes, I think they probably win this game. I just think that was a key factor. That I think it does change the outcome of this game for sure.
Yeah, and then Jaylen Brown, he played well in the second half, but in the first half he was pretty awful.
Yeah.
And you're just like, the idea in terms of Boston and Phillies, you're kind of assuming that Tatum is going to be either 1 or 2,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of best player on the floor,
Mm-hmm.
and then Jaylen Brown is probably going to be 2 or 3. I think that's your hope. And
Mm-hmm.
then after that, you got Porzingis, you got White, you got Holiday, Horford, right? Peyton Pritchard didn't really do anything in this
No.
game, right? He's been a guy that's had a great season for the Celtics thus far, right? Having a career year as their backup point guard, right? And who now basically plays starter minutes, and just doesn't miss shots at all, pretty much. So, that's also kind of a swing piece there. So I'm still going with Boston, like in terms of like if those two teams play,
Yeah.
I would still pick the Celtics to win. But if you're the Sixers again, you got to feel good about, going in and getting a win against the Boston Celtics in Boston, right? Who've played very well this season. Obviously, like the Celtics have had a couple of bad games recently, right? Like they lost to the Magic beforehand, right? And that was the Magic without, obviously Paolo and Franz, um, from that perspective. And then obviously they just lost this Sixers game. So, again, like every team has like a tough stretch, but just in general, yeah, the Sixers, Boston didn't really play that well. And like even the final score, like they were down 15 in the fourth,
Yeah.
and then they just kind of had these weird meltdown turnovers where they almost tried to give the game to Boston. So the final score was kind of better than what it really was in the
Mm-hmm.
fourth. Like the Sixers just couldn't miss, and that pretty much ended the game there.
Yeah.
But I feel like it was just more a perspective of like, I don't think Boston played that well. And I think if you get like a normal Celtics game, that probably would have been enough. But again, if those two teams meet and play against each other, like, is it going to be a sweep? Like, if Embiid is healthy and plays well, it shouldn't be.
No.
Um, I think for the Celtics, I just think there may be too much talent to overcome, specifically like in some of the areas where Boston is strong. Although, like, Philly can, match them or, in terms of 3-point production because they have a lot of 3-point
Yeah.
shooting. Just in general, it's do you trust the ancillary pieces after Joel Embiid and Maxey and I guess George? Do you trust them? And like really, the swing piece is Maxey for Philly because if he can play, somewhere in between like Tatum and Brown, like say if he outplays Jaylen Brown in a series between the two teams, that might actually be enough for Philly to be able to pull it off. But I don't expect Brown to have like a bad series against this team, but I could be wrong. But that to me is the swing piece there, which again is not a hot take or a shocker.
Mm-hmm.
It's just that's what's going to have to happen for Philly to win. Is you're going to need Maxey to play, because he was basically like the best player on the floor today, right? Like a sense like him and Tatum basically, and so like from that perspective, if that's what's going to happen, then that's probably not a good sign for Boston, right? So
Yeah.
you don't really want that.
Yeah, because I think this would kind of be what the roadmap would look like if Philly were to steal a game in Boston. I think this is exactly how it would look out, and this is exactly how it would play out. I think because and we talked about this going into the season where Tyrese Maxey was going to be the elevator for Philly. Like if he plays not better
Yeah.
than Embiid and Paul George, but if he's like interchangeable between the number one and number two, then I think you feel a lot better about what they can accomplish. So I think if you can get this version of Maxey in the postseason, that's going to be insane. I
Yeah.
think you do need Paul George to show up, and that's kind of the big question mark still. In this
Yeah.
game, like you said, didn't do a whole lot of anything, but Caleb Martin came in and saved the day.
Yeah.
And I agree with you 100%. Like Jaylen Brown's not going to have a bad series against Philly. I think he's going to have probably like one or two bad games, but I think overall, when it matters and when it counts, he's going to show up.
Yeah, and I think that's really the key here. And again, in a one-game scenario, this is kind of where anything can happen. And this is like, if you're Boston, this is a setup where you're probably going to lose. Like if Tyrese Maxey by the end of the game is basically the best player on the floor, you're not winning that game.
Yeah, right.
Then moving on, Knicks Spurs. This was the first game of the day, right? This was the noon game, and this was a great game as well,
Yeah.
right? It was 117-114 New York, right? And this was kind of the showdown between obviously, the young star Wemby, right? He is 42 and 18, but obviously we'll start with the Knicks because they're the winning team. And the star was Mikal Bridges, right? 41 and 4 with 2 steals and 2 blocks. 6 of 9 from 3, made basically every big shot for the Knicks down the stretch. And this is kind of what you were hoping to get, from Mikal Bridges, right, when the Knicks traded for them, right? Right, because they gave up a lot in terms of draft capital to get him, right? What was it, like 7 picks or whatever
Yep.
it was? And to start the season, he wasn't really that great, right? He just wasn't. It just wasn't, like he wasn't defending that well. He wasn't shooting that well to begin the season. But, pretty much in the last month, right, over the course of December, he's played, some really, really good basketball. And you're kind of finding that good balance between, like they do need him to be a solid offensive option while also being like a solid, defender as well. Like, I mean, if you look at his stats over the course of December, he's given them, over 20 a game, right? 22.7, 2.5, 3.5, shooting 58 from the field and
Yes,
47
sir.
from three. After when you watch, if you look at his November splits, right? That's the part where, he wasn't playing well. 14 a game, 4 rebounds, 43 from the field, 29 from three. So, that's kind of the difference there is that when and again, he's not going to score 40 in every game, but if he can be, somewhere close to the high teens to, somewhere close to that, right? High teens, 20 or so, um, that's going to help the Knicks. And like their strength is their offense, right? And the defense has been much better, as of late, which is one of the reasons why, they've been playing much better compared to what they were doing to begin the season. But just in general, because like even in this game, like Brunson was 7 for 23, 20 points, 9 assists, 7 rebounds. So he made some good plays in terms of passing, but this wasn't one of his best games. But again, this is why you go out and get guys like Bridges and Towns, right? Like, and Towns was in foul trouble, was a -13, 21-9, right? So not his best game, but he's been very good for the Knicks, right? Hart with some key offensive boards, right? The Knicks had 17 offensive rebounds, right? Which hadn't really been what they've been doing for most of the season, right? They've kind of been, a different team this year. But, these are the type of games and performances you want to see from the Knicks, right? Like, say, like last year, right? It was kind of like Brunson has to bail him out. Can you get good performances from other guys, right? But just in general, the fact that now you have some more go-to guys offensively to play through is great. And again, we've talked about it, the ability to play five out. Now Achua's back, so now you can play some bigger lineups, and you actually have some, decent size off the bench, right? I think they trust him more, than Jericho Sims, right? Because he's basically taking his minutes. Um, and again, the bench is still at times, kind of shaky, but the starting five is awesome. And they were able to survive a crazy Wemby game, right? Again, one of the best Christmas debuts you will ever see.
Yes.
Right? 4 blocks, right? But it felt like it was more than that, obviously, like, in terms of impacting shots around the rim. But again, for the Spurs, their main issue has been in late in games, it's tougher for them just because, again, outside of a couple of guys, it's still a younger team. And you just don't have, like, that elite second option after Wemby, right? Like Chris Paul was fine in this game, but Devin Vassell didn't really have that great of a game. That's kind of the guy I think in the starting five after Wemby you would hope to kind of find ways to get going. And even off the bench, not like a lot of great performances. Yeah, I mean, again, like this was almost like a backpack game, but and again for the Spurs, that's going to be their development, right? Like they're in a different stage right now than the Knicks, where the Knicks are trying to be ready to win right now, whereas the Spurs are trying to get there and still developing guys. So from a Wemby perspective, you're pretty much getting everything you want to see out of him. Like the
Yes.
fact that he's already this good in year two, right? Where he's basically playing at like an all NBA level, right? Which is kind of what we talked about could
Yeah.
possibly happen. Or maybe could he be borderline top 10, somewhere around that area. And if he's that, then that can get you closer to being a potential playoff team. You know, Still kind of tough, right? Just from the perspective of I don't necessarily know if they can get to the playoffs, but just with how that lower tier of the West has been, like I mean, they're 15 and 15, so right now they're 11th.
Hmm.
But if they could find a way to, get a decent stretch of play going, they could be right back in it. But I still don't think they'll end up making it. But either way, in terms of Wemby, which is your franchise guy, this is everything you want to see in terms of him continuing to get better and finding ways to be impactful on both ends of the floor, even with like a less than ideal situation, but it's a better situation than it was last season just because you do have some veterans.
Yeah, I think this was one of my favorite games. I think, of the Christmas ones, and I think it starts with Wemby because of what he brings to the table. On
Hmm.
both ends of the floor, it's really magical. And I know people were talking about how bad of a start that he had to the season, but look at the turnaround. And if he
Yep.
can keep this up and continue to, look like this, I think there's a conversation that we're probably going to have, later on in the season about where he ranks. But the problem, like you said, is that talent kind of tapers off after you get past his name. And especially like throughout the entire squad. That not just the starting lineup. It's really rough actually. But I think you do have some takeaways from it. Like you feel okay that they have an actual guard rotation. I think you feel good that there are some guys that kind of can come in as energy pieces. I think Sohan's been relatively better as of late. Vassell's been actually pretty underrated. I think just had a bad game in this one, in my opinion. But I think he's kind of solidifying himself as he's probably going to end up being the third option on like a serious Spurs team. So
Mhm.
I kind of am expecting them to figure out a way to get a second option to pair with Wemby, and then everything else will kind of fill in. That's kind of what they're missing, I think. But from a New York perspective, I couldn't have been happier. This is my pick to win the finals, so they're kind of looking more like what I thought they were going to look coming into the season. And Bridges seems to have figured it out, and I think you explained it pretty well. Where it's like, yeah, you want to get a Bridges because number one, he brings a lot on defense, but if one of these guys is having a okayish night, he can probably fill in and bring that offensive intensity as well. Like even like a guy like Anunoby, like him, Anunoby, Brunson, they didn't really have like a great game combined, but it makes up for it because Bridges is out there cooking and he fixed the jumper. It looks good. Everything just looks better than what it did earlier in the season. I think you can't really put it into words how good that is for New York because I think when all of your options are pretty much ready to go offensively and can fire off like that, I think that's a huge positive. It's just, there still are some questions defensively because we all know I don't think Towns is necessarily a bad defender, but more so a dumb defender. That's kind of the way that I would put it, where it's like a lot of unnecessary fouls. I think there was one foul where he literally tripped him because I don't know who it was, but he tripped somebody, but he tried to blame it on his shoes being too big. Like, no. Like that, those are the kinds of fouls that Towns will pick up. And it's like, we don't need that. So, I think if you are New York, you do feel good. Granted, it was against the Spurs, but to be able to survive a 42-point outing from Wemby, I think that's pretty good.
The Spurs had the lead late in the game, so it
Yeah.
wasn't like, the Knicks were dominating. Like the Spurs were up for most of the game.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Yep.
and it looked like, that the Spurs were going to come in and possibly steal it, right? And then, obviously Bridges closes it out. So, and again, like that's going to happen over the course of the season. But again, these were the type of games that the Knicks were losing earlier in the year, right? So, I mean, now that they're winning these games, you feel much better about them. They're 8-2 in the last 10 games, third in offensive rating, 10th in defensive rating. So pretty much, everything that, like you said, you would want to see from them,
Yeah.
you've seen from them as of late. And that's good because, again, you want to see progression from this team because we know, like, this is a different team from last year. So it's not like, say, the Celtics were like, they're just good enough where they can just have games where they can just kind of cruise and just win over the course of the year because they're all familiar and comfortable with one another. The Knicks, they kind of have had to learn on the fly how to adjust and how to play together. And that's with guys having been in and out of the rotation due to injury at different points, right? Because,
Yeah.
Achua didn't play to begin the season, and now he's back, right? You'll, at some point, presumably be waiting for Mitchell Robinson to come back, whenever that is. So, there'll be more help on the way. We'll see if they do anything at the deadline. But, again, like, this is real. Like, this is real progression in terms of, like, you feel much better about this team compared to where they were earlier in the season. And that's why, like, again, now we're at the 30 game mark, right? So it would, so we're getting closer to the halfway point of the season. So
Mm-hmm.
now that we're getting closer to that point and they look better, like that's what you want, right?
Yeah.
Like, like, and with, because like some of these other teams, right? Like, I don't know, like say the Sixers, right? Like they've been playing better as well, but they started off so horrible to
Yep.
begin the season. They've given themselves, very little room for error, but for the Knicks, like you're third in the East. And, unless, maybe one of these other teams can catch up because it's not like they're way ahead, but they already beat the Bucks earlier in the season, so for now, like they do have a tiebreaker advantage over them, and I believe they have one over Orlando as well. So for them, like as long as they can kind of keep pace and continue to do what they've been doing, like they could possibly, you know, seal the 3 seed. Maybe obviously we're not there yet, but if they can get home court, then that's what you want for them.
Yes.
And I
Yeah.
mean like they're good on the road as well. Like they're 10-6 on the road, but they're also 10-4 at home.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Exactly.
This is a good team now. Like this isn't the team from earlier in the season. I know
Yeah.
people, kind of look at them and view them in a certain light, but this is a better team from what we saw earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And then, these other two games, right, weren't quite as impressive as the first three, but, they had their moments. You had the Mavs and the Wolves. This one was significant from the perspective of, obviously, it's a rematch of the Western Conference Finals. And obviously the Mavs had the edge in that series 4-1, but the Wolves ended up pulling this one out. Now, obviously, in the first half, Luka ends up getting hurt. Now it sounds like he's going to be out for a while, right? He had to leave the game in crutches. We still don't know like a timeline or anything. He was supposed to have an MRI. We'll see what happens, but the fact that he was in crutches and they already said they're expecting him to miss time, like that's not a good thing. And this was weird anyways, because for the Wolves, right, they were up by 28 points in the third quarter. And it was funny because at that point I'd actually left the game to do something else, only just because, again, it was like a 30-point
I don't
game.
blame you.
I thought, all right, this game's probably over. They're probably
Yep.
going to empty the bench relatively soon.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I come back, and then it's basically a two-possession game.
Yep.
Obviously, without Luka, right, because I ended up rewatching it, right? Kyrie ended up, going off, right? He ended up having 39 in the game, right? And it was a tie game. They were this close to possibly pulling off the upset victory, which would have been absolutely brutal for Minnesota. But obviously the Wolves were able to hang on because, again, like a 28-point comeback is just I know these big comebacks are more common now,
Yeah.
but just 28, like especially in the second half, it's just very difficult because you got to play perfect.
Yep.
And for the Wolves, right, like, and for the Mavs, they did everything to tie it up. Then you had like a one bad shot by Kyrie, right? Then like a defensive possession where it was kind of like they doubled Edwards, and then he lost the ball or whatever, or they didn't score, and then the Wolves or the Mavs don't get a good shot. And then the next possession down, then it's like Kyrie being switched on to Edwards, and Edwards
Yeah.
goes right by him, gets the
Yeah.
layup, basically to seal the game.
Yep.
Randall, right, hits some big shots in this game. But just in general, right, for the Wolves, this is a game where, this is what you want to see, right? Like, you got a really good game from Julius Randle. Edwards obviously was really good in this game as well. Obviously, in the second half, it started to get really ugly, right? It turned into bad Timberwolves. But, obviously, their two guys were able to close it out. But just in general, it's just obviously they won the game, but it's just been such a disappointing season from a Wolves standpoint, just because this was a team where I think we were lower on the trade for Minnesota than we were for New York. But I don't think we expected the Wolves to be like this, where they've basically been an average basketball team.
Yeah.
Like, I think we expected them to take a step back. I basically said this would be a gap year,
Mm-hmm.
but it's just frustrating because, games like this is where, like, if they could have these type of consistent performances on the offensive end, then that's where you would feel much better about them. But you just don't get that with any level of consistency. Mike Conley had 10 in this game, 4 of 9 from the field. Edwards, as we already mentioned, 26, 8, and 5 in his first Christmas game. Randall with 23, 10, and 8, 8 assists, right? He made some big passes too, right? And when he can do stuff like that, that can help them on offense. Naz Reid was 6 off the bench. Again, like, it ended up being like not a ton of high scoring, obviously, because of the second half. But DiVincenzo, 11 points, right? He played a better game than he had, for most of this season, right? Because he's just not really been that good. Nickeil Alexander-Walker. So just, good contributions from some of your other guys, and then your stars played well. And then from the Mavs perspective, it just sucks because you lost the game, and now you've lost Luka
Yeah.
for what's presumably going to be a pretty significant stretch. And they have been able to they've been good even when he hasn't played. But obviously him being out for like a week or so is a lot different than what could possibly be several weeks. We don't know how long or how significant his absence will be, but this is why you get a guy like a Kyrie Irving, right? Because presumably he's going to be the go-to guy while Luka's out. More shots, I guess, for the other role players, so they'll have an opportunity to kind of put up some numbers. We'll see what other guys like, Najee Marshall, right, Klay Thompson, PJ Washington. It's going to have to be wins by committee. It's just tough because obviously for Luka, right, this is now going to be an injury-riddled season where probably not going to qualify for, like All-NBA or All-Star. Now, my pick for MVP is pretty much gone. And obviously it's a significant injury, right? So you don't want a scenario where, he comes back and then it may take him some time, because by and large he's not like a guy that's generally speaking like in the best shape compared to other NBA players, but just in general, just rough, right? Because you went into this game expecting a good game, and it ended up closing into a solid close, right? But for a while it was ugly, just from it being a blowout. But Minnesota played well.
Yeah.
But that's kind of the main takeaway from this game is for the Mavs. It's just now you've lost Luka, and they had been playing really well, and it felt like they had been playing their best basketball of the season. To where you kind of feel like, all right, this looks like the team that went to the finals compared to what they were doing earlier in the season when they weren't playing very well. And now with this loss, now they're kind of pushing closer to the teams below them, right? Like the Nuggets have only the Nuggets have one more loss than the Mavs. They've played fewer games,
Hmm.
but just in general, like the Lakers have only two more losses than Dallas. And if you're the Mavs and you start to kind of lose some of these games that you might have won, had Luca been there, then you're gonna start to slide. Like they're gonna play the Suns, they're gonna play the Kings, they're gonna play the Rockets, they're gonna play Cleveland, they're gonna play Memphis, they're gonna play the Lakers. So they don't have like a super easy schedule coming up. So this is like the worst possible time to have an injury like this, because if they lose a handful of these games, if they go 500 or worse, they're gonna drop probably, right? Because one of these teams below them may start to kind of play better, but that's basically for them. They're gonna have to at least be 500. Like if they're any worse than that, then they're gonna drop, and by the time he comes back, whenever that is, right, they may be in a pickle, depending on what happens.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough from the Mavericks perspective. Like you said, losing Luka Doncic is probably one of the worst things that could have possibly happened, and it's probably at the worst time, like you said, because the standings are so tight in their area that they're in, and you without your best player, you're obviously going to start dropping games. But I guess the positive is Klay Thompson passed Reggie Miller in the all-time three-pointers list, so congrats to Klay for that. But I think even then, you would still want more from him in this game. Honestly, I think you just kind of wanted a little bit more from everybody. Granted, though, they did almost pull off a crazy comeback, but I think the Edwards play was pretty ridiculous, where he kind of just activates the clutch gene and notices the mismatch and just goes straight at it. No second guessing it at all. And I think that's kind of like the thing where we already know that Anthony Edwards can do that. It's just, can the team kind of rally around that? And I think they did do that, towards the end of the game. And I think, like you said, Julius Randle having a good game offensively and being able to showcase that playmaking is definitely something that can take them to the next level. If he's not like a black hole, then I think that will help them and, distribute the ball everywhere else. But I don't know. There are still some question marks, I think, offensively in the starting lineup, which I don't think will be able to be figured out this season. And I think that kind of goes back to what you were saying, where it's like a gap year. I think they kind of just want to see where Edwards is probably going to be at by the end of the season. Can Julius Randle and Anthony Edwards even coexist in a playoff run? Those are kind of questions that I think they're trying to answer themselves. And then, maybe they'll figure out a way to bolster up the offense and also keep the integrity of the defense a little bit. But overall, I thought it was a good game in going into the fourth quarter, to be honest.
Yeah, like if Randall can be that other ball handler playmaker that can
Mm-hmm.
get guys involved. Like he was throwing lobs to Gobert at different points in the game, kind of like Towns was doing
Yeah.
at different points, right? If he can do stuff like that, that can unlock some of their offense, in addition to obviously what he can do as a scorer. But, like you said, if he gets into kind of the score first mode and doesn't look to get guys involved, that's where it's probably going to be a little bit rougher
Yes.
because they don't have the personnel where they can just kind of give it to anybody and just be like, go get us a bucket. Or they don't have a lot of really consistent offensive players. So, that's kind of where you need your two stars to, kind of also be their play. And again, that's kind of why those guys are one-on-one guys, right? Because it's like they use their ability to score one-on-one to also open up the floor for their teammates. It's just, again, it's not necessarily the greatest combination of players because, as we've talked about at different points, the paint can get clogged. The driving lanes for Edwards aren't necessarily ideal. But it's just, again, like, I can't expect them to play that type of game like every night like you could last season. I mean, like last season, right? They were elite on defense, not great on offense, but because they were so good on defense, all they had to do was not be terrible on offense. And they, again, we know, again, we talked about it the last time they played, where their record at this point last year was like 22-6.
Hmm.
So now they've taken a huge step back this season. And they are 6-4 in their last 10. It's just, a lot of their losses were more recent, and those losses were really ugly, where it was kind of the same issues over and over again. And you're just kind of waiting for some of these guys to kind of just pick up the play. And if they can, then maybe they can kind of salvage it for a playoff run. But I don't think there's a version of this team that's a championship team. I just don't really
Yeah.
see it, in my opinion. But, again, there's still plenty of basketball left, but we are getting closer to the halfway point. So, we're going to have to see what they kind of do as of late, right? Like this next stretch will probably be like the stretch to kind of determine like what is this team really? Because if they
Yeah.
can play like this, then you'll feel better about it. But if not, and that's just kind of a flash in the pan, then they'll probably just be up and down. And then
Yes,
they'll
sir.
probably just be, somewhere between 5 and 8.
Yeah. But that's rough considering where they were last year. But I think, like you said, we did expect them to kind of look worse. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then the final game, you had the Nuggets and the Suns. And this was kind of a funny game just from the perspective of this was actually obviously this was a rematch of the playoffs from a couple seasons ago. And they've actually had two playoff, matchups in the last few years, right? Because the one where the Suns went to the finals and then the one where the Nuggets went to the finals, funny enough. But either way, this was also one of those games where they just played each other the game before, right? And in the previous game, the Nuggets blew out the Suns, right? That was a game where Jamal Murray was out, and Devin Booker was out. This time around, Murray's back, Booker's still out, but the Suns end up pulling off the win,
Yes, sir.
110-100. The Nuggets, I think in that final stretch got it, closer to 10 or whatever. But just by and large, the Suns were in control for most of the game. This was a game where you got the good offensive contributions from Bradley Beal. Durant was 9 for 26, but did make shots from inside the 3-point line, right, where the Nuggets didn't really have really an answer for that. Yusuf Nurkic, right, 13 rebounds, 6 assists, 8 points, so decent game from him. You got 17 and 4 from Tyus Jones. Off the bench, Monte Morris, Josh Okogie, right, getting more minutes. So a solid game from the Suns. And then from the Nuggets perspective, just not a good Jamal Murray game again. Just hasn't been as effective this season. 13, 6 and 6, 4 of 10 from the field. Not a good Christian Brown game either, right? 2 of 7 from the field, 5 points. Not good on defense either. 25 and 15 from Jokic, but only 2 assists. And if you're the Suns, that's what you want because we talked about it before, right? The games where Jokic burns you, where the Nuggets burn you, is if Jokic gets anywhere close to like 30, 10, and 10. If he's anywhere near those numbers, that makes it
Yep.
more likely the Nuggets will win. Obviously, this team isn't quite as good as the ones before, but just, only having 2 assists, that's what you want if you're the Suns. Aaron Gordon didn't do much, also got hurt in the game, only played 19 minutes. Michael Porter Jr. with 22. Westbrook was 17 and 6. Most of that in the first half, not as much in the second half. And just kind of interesting because again, these two teams just played each other a couple days ago, and again, the Nuggets were just kind of just smashing the Suns. But this is kind of one of those examples where this is the difficulty of playing a team twice in a short amount of time. Where again, like Minnesota and Golden State, that happened earlier in the season, and Minnesota won handedly the first one. The Warriors won the second one. And again, people talk about this matchup because it's a matchup where it seems like the Suns, even though they don't necessarily have like a ton of elite high level defenders in size, offensively they've been able to match up against the Nuggets, right? Because of the perimeter shooting, the shot creation, from the Suns guards, right? Or from the Suns offensive guys like Beal, like Durant, Jones in this game as well, but Booker when he's healthy. So, this one was probably, of the games, this one was like not the least interesting, but this was the one where like, it was kind of the most, we didn't really have the crunch time moment like you had even with the Wolves Mavs game.
Sure.
This one, like the Suns were, I know the Nuggets got it tied or whatever and maybe had brief leads, but by and large, like the Suns controlled most of this game. You felt like the Suns were going to win this one. So it was a good bounce back game from the Phoenix Suns, who have also been struggling as of late, right? They're 4 and 6 in their last 10. And they've now bounced back up to 8 in the Western Conference, right? Obviously, it's a 3-way tie between them, the Wolves, and the Warriors, right? They have the tiebreaker over Golden State. They have not played the Warriors, or they have not played the Timberwolves yet. But, just in general, again, with as tight of a race as that the playoffs or as the standings are going to be, this is a good win for Phoenix and, an important win because, again, you lose both of these games, right? You drop to 14 and 15, and then you're the team, right, that's basically at that 10 spot. And again, they're all separated by a game or so. So any of these teams, as we've consistently talked about, are a 6-4 stretch away from moving up 3-4 spots, and then a 4-6 stretch away from moving down a few spots. So, again, we'll see. With the Suns, the main thing is can they be healthy, right? Because again, like in the last few weeks, right, they have not had the big three play together, right? Because like either Durant's been out or
Mm-hmm.
recently Booker's been out.
Mm-hmm.
But again, like they were able to kind of pull out this win, which is good for them.
Yeah, I
And for the
mean,
Nuggets, it's not good.
yeah,
Just
no.
because of even though their record is 16 and 12, it just continues to showcase some of the problems with this team. Where again, if you don't have a good Jamal Murray, not that it's impossible to win, but championship wise, you don't have as much of a shot. And this is supposed to be the team of those 5 to 10 that should, in theory, have the highest ceiling because they have the best player and, presumably a decent supporting cast. I know people don't like some of the surrounding pieces, but you have Jokic as well. But you just haven't gotten that with Murray, and that's the one that sticks out like a sore thumb because even in the regular season, he's never been like, a top whatever player, but he's been better than this. And that's kind of the distinction there where like, and also without, some of the role players they used to have, you need Jamal Murray to probably be closer, to playoff version Jamal Murray in the regular season. And we just have not seen that with any level of consistency.
Yeah, they might not have that one in them. I'm not gonna lie. I don't think they're capable of that, and I think they've proven that somewhat. And especially to do it on the national stage, on Christmas Day is not good. I do kind of want to go back to the Suns a little bit. I have thoroughly liked what I've seen from Bradley Beal in the past couple of games. I think what he's been able to do. If you get this version of him, the one on Christmas Day, not every single night, but the
Right.
majority of the games where, one of these guys isn't playing, then I think you're okay. I think you feel good about having him on the team. I think you feel good about him being the third option because I think he did a lot offensively, even did some funny stuff defensively. He actually got a block that led to a lob. Like that's the way this game went. There are a lot of uncharacteristic things. There were some highlights, like buzzer beaters from Jamal Murray, but at the end of the day, like you said, it wasn't as entertaining as the other ones per se, but still a solid game.
Yeah.
KD, I wasn't really impressed with what he did in this game, to be honest. It was kind of just hope and pray that Jokic doesn't have a monster game, and that's kind of what they did. But they also got themselves over the hump by playing pretty efficiently offensively as a team and as a unit, and I think that's what you would want if you're Phoenix. But for Denver, I don't even know really what to say because you give Russ his credit. I think he played pretty well, and he has been playing well the past
Yeah.
4 or 5 games. So he's looked pretty
Yeah.
solid, and he's been like the bright spot off the bench, which I think everybody's joyous about. But it's the other guys like Jamal Murray. You cannot have a game where Jamal Murray is 4 for 10 with 13
Mhm.
points. I just don't think that's good enough. That's not going to cut it.
Especially against this team.
Exactly. This is a team where he should kind of be taking advantage of, some mismatches and defensive matchups that he's going to be exposed to. But regardless, that did not happen whatsoever. And I think, Phoenix did a great job of eliminating that playmaking aspect from Jokic's game because, then it kind of forces him to not necessarily like, take bad shots, but maybe have to think a little bit more in terms of what he has to do as an individual player than, per se the team. And, when you take away his ability to make others better, I think that's kind of the key for success. Michael Porter Jr., he had an okay game, but it really kind of felt empty to me, to be honest. And that's kind of how I felt about the majority of, Denver's players and their stats, just very empty. But, Phoenix got the job done on the national stage. So shout out to them.
Yeah, and like you said with the Beal piece, again, like his name has been in some rumors as
Yeah.
of late, right? But like you said, with Booker out, that's the guy that you need to step up, right? Because you assume, and like you said, Durant wasn't amazing, but just in general, like you assume, like without Booker, Beal's the next man up in terms if he's playing, right, to kind of step up, and that's kind of supposed to be the benefit of having 3 stars is that if one guy is out, then the other two should be able to kind of make up for it, right? Like we've kind of seen that if they don't have Durant, they don't really have much of a chance right? Which is, again, we've talked about the record with and without KD. And he obviously he played in this game, right? So as long as you have Durant and then one of Beal or Booker, you should be able to get it done. But they haven't been able to do that as much as of late. But again, it's just kind of wild, right? Because, we talked about the matchups with these Christmas games, and a lot of the teams, that were in these matchups are not necessarily teams that are right at the top of the conference, right? Like obviously, Dallas was fourth in the West. But outside of that, right, like Denver's five, right? The Lakers and Warriors and Suns and Wolves are all like in that, we're in that like 6 to 10 range. Philly obviously is 11, and like some of these are just like I don't think the NBA expected some of those teams to be quite as underwhelming as they've been, right? Like the Spurs were the only one where you kind of knew that they probably weren't going to be that great. But even they've been, I think, maybe a little better than some people expected. But like, say you didn't get the Bucks, right? Like no Giannis, no OKC.
Mm-hmm.
But the Christmas slate of games, right, ended up being really good, right? Because
Really
I think a
freaking
lot of
good.
people were, because again, people like to complain about everything, even again, including the slate of games. But this ended up being really good because again, you got in general really good performances from both teams in most of these games and some really memorable moments, including again like a game winner and things like that. So
Mm-hmm.
just in general, um and they were also rewarded in terms of the viewership stats, right? Because it was talked about where this was the most watched NBA Christmas day in 5 years,
Yep.
right? Like I think the ratings were up like 84%.
Yes, sir.
And then the Warriors Lakers one, right, specifically, that one was not just the most watched Christmas game in 5 years, it was also the most watched regular season game period in
Mm-hmm.
5 years, right? Like, I mean, it was like, I think a little over 8 million people watched this game, which you don't usually get that for an NBA regular season game,
Yep.
right? It's usually like, in terms of the cable numbers, maybe like a few million, right? Like not much more than like two, maybe three, at best, for a lot of those type of games. But, again, and obviously we've talked about it, right? That's kind of a testament to the star power that LeBron and Steph have, right? As, two Titans faces of the NBA.
Mm-hmm.
And just in general, right? Like the quality of the games, right? And, we've also talked about like one kind of annoying aspect of a lot of games recently has been like some of the, stoppages in play, right? The random officiating and things like that. But in this game, in all these games, it was pretty clean,
How
right?
long
Like,
the
I don't,
games take to start? That's another one.
yeah. And like the ABC, ESPN ones, those always never start on time, right?
Yeah.
It's like 15 minutes or
Yep.
whatever. But these were all like pretty clean games. And
Mm-hmm.
they were all also, I think, on the same station, right? Like they were all on
Yeah.
ABC and in years past, right? Like last year, you had like a couple of games on ESPN,
Yeah, it was
like
crazy.
a couple of games on ABC, and things like that. But, this was a much cleaner transition, which I think is what you want, right? Because again, we've talked about like the lack of easy access, to a lot of these games, and just overall sometimes the effort level and again the officiating and things like that. But again, you pretty much got as good of a Christmas day as what you could have hoped for, right? And
Yes.
again, the signature line, was kind of LeBron at the end of that Laker Warriors game where he said, to the NFL, Christmas is our day,
Yeah.
right?
The NFL
Obviously,
games were crap.
yeah, and the NBA games were all very good, right?
Yeah.
Again, even the worst ones, right, were still good for like a regular season game, in general. And it's pretty much everybody gets credit, for this one. So credit to everyone involved for making sure that this was a really good day of hoops,
Yes,
and
sir.
because we needed this, right? Because
Yes.
again, as we talked about, there's been so much discourse surrounding the NBA recently in terms of the viewership. Nobody watches the games. The style of play is hideous. The stars don't care and things like that. But for one day, you got the exact opposite of that, and you got pretty much everything perfect.
Yeah, I thought they did a great job marketing it too. They did a good job in terms of the presentation, commentary, officiating. I thought everything was, A1. They were on their A game. The Christmas stimulus package hopefully will help the freaking NBA, regain its popularity this season. And I think it will. Because this is when everybody really starts to tune in and, they realize, oh, the NBA is actually going on, so I think that this will help in the long run, and I really can't wait till we get to the All-Star break.
Yeah. And now we're gonna get into some news and rumors. Not like a ton necessarily to speak of. There are a few, according to Mark Stein. Grizzlies eyeing Dorian Finney-Smith, right? And again, if you're the Memphis Grizzlies, this is a team where you want to be kind of in the mix for. Doesn't have to be a star, but like say role players like that, because we've talked about it like going into the season. One of the things that we didn't love as much about the Grizzlies was the wing depth, right? Because it's like a lot of guys that are kind of guards masquerading as wings, sort of, right? From, like even like guys like Vince Williams, um, and players like that. And it's not like their wing depth is horrible. Like it's been better, I think, than like Jalen Wells obviously has been a revelation. Some of these other guys haven't even really played, like Vince Williams and G.G. Jackson.
Mhm.
But again, that's a guy where that's another wing you can kind of plug in there. And he doesn't cost he doesn't cost like a ridiculous amount of money, right? Like they can kind of pull together a couple of players and kind of pull off something like that. So if they could do that again, it's not necessarily like a life changer, but it's another veteran, right, that can play on both ends of the floor, that's on a team, right, where you're not asking a ton out of him and can just kind of be a plug and play guy.
Yeah, you should never I think you should always be interested in a team or a player, that's on like a quality role player that's on a bad team. You know what I mean? Like I think that should be kind of their recipe and what they go after. And I think he kind of fits the mold. And like you were saying, the lack of wing depth is definitely very very prevalent on that team. And bringing him in, I think would be easy because he's definitely a plug and play guy.
Yeah, exactly. And then more Jimmy Butler stuff. Actually, earlier today, recording this. We're recording this on Thursday, and you'll see it on Friday. But Pat Riley, right, for the Heat, he kind of made it. He made it known that Jimmy Butler's not staying. Do I buy it? Not necessarily. I think some of that maybe is he probably doesn't love the offers that teams are probably, giving them for Jimmy Butler. Also, Miami Herald puts out that he was disappointed that they didn't offer him an extension, and that's kind of the difficulty there. Is that again, he's got that player option. You're gonna have to give up about 50 million in terms of salary to get him, and presumably whoever trades for him, like you would want to, you're gonna trade for him and presumably re-sign him to some type of deal, right? Like and he's already 35, right? So let's say you give him an extra 2 years, right? Then you're talking about 37, going on to 38. And, he's a guy that has not been as available in recent seasons. But if he's healthy, and if he can be anything, similar to what he can do when, in terms of like when he's consistently playing, it could be a solid addition. It's just a matter of what version of him are we getting. And, is a team willing to do that type of extension? Because it's just depending on the team, it may be a gamble to get like 1 year of Jimmy Butler and then he just leaves. Now, I'm not saying that that's going to happen because usually you don't make a move like that unless unless you get some type of inkling that they're going to stay. But just in general, I don't know. And then like from the Heat's perspective, what do they want back for Jimmy Butler, right? Like, and like, what do they want back? Are they okay with getting back like, would they prefer to get guys on bad contracts? Would they prefer to get like young players? Would they prefer to get draft capital? I don't know. But, it's question there are questions that both teams kind of have to answer. And, again, there's no rush like, you have until the trade deadline. It's just I think if you're a team that wants Butler, you prefer to have him sooner rather than later, right? Like if you're Golden State and you want him, you don't want to wait until February because then you have like, you're more than 50 games into the season, right? Like you need him right now so that
Yeah.
that way you can, kind of, fix the slide that you're on. Or if you're the Rockets, right? Or what any other team, Phoenix, right? Like whatever team is interested in grabbing him, or if it's a surprise team, you would like to kind of get him as soon as possible so that way you can work him in to the team and kind of figure out stuff. Obviously, he hasn't played recently because he's been sick, but either way, there's obviously pros and cons to doing this for both teams.
Yeah. I think Jimmy Butler. I think the question is going to be what is his value, like you said. And it's going to depend. I think from team to team because I think if it's a team that has a bunch of young players and assets, then I'm sure Miami's going to want all of them and more. But then if it's a team that has a star and they kind of want to do a swap for swap, then I think that might be a little bit easier to get done. But it really all depends on these GMs and all the factors that are going to be taken into account. So I am curious, what the end result is going to be. And that's the funny thing about the NBA and stuff like this is nothing could happen. That would be the funniest part, is if all this chatter and talk and there's absolutely no result where Jimmy Butler ends up leaving. Do I think he's going to leave? I think he's out of there. But, you do always have that in the back of your head where you never know.
Yeah, and according to Shams, he prefers a move before the deadline, which again makes sense, right? Because if he's not going to want to, because if they're not, if it's pretty clear that he's probably not signing an extension, then like they're not going to give it to him, then ideally both sides should probably find a way to move on. It's just a matter of where is he going to go, and I think that's kind of the big question there.
Yeah.
According to Shams, he doesn't expect a Zion trade. And I think that's kind of what we talked about, where like you should look to, if you're New Orleans, explore all options. But the first thing that you should probably try to figure out is the Ingram situation. And then also, like, maybe could you get something for a McCollum? Because, like, with Ingram, he's got the expiring deal. And for McCollum, he's just an older NBA vet. So those are the guys, that I think those are the first guys that you should kind of, like, call and see, like, hey, is anybody interested? Obviously, you make calls for Zion as well. But I think of the guys that are the most likely to be moved, if you had to rank those three, it's probably Ingram is probably one, and then it's probably McCollum, and then Zion is third.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And, we talked about it earlier in the season. Like, me personally, I would probably move on from Zion, but there is always that, like you said, that tier of priority where you would most likely want to move on from those other guys and figure out those situations first before you do end up pulling the trigger on something like that, because that is your franchise guy. It's just, the potential year in and year out, it just seems to really be going down the drain and being wasted. So I am curious what the end result of that whole saga is going to be. But, it makes sense to get the McCollum and Brandon Ingram situation sorted out before, going after Zion.
Yeah. Well, that's it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, we hope that you all had a great holiday, celebration, whatever you did. And hopefully you enjoyed the NBA games as much as we did, right? If you didn't, maybe you might be, the type to grab a guy and then grab two guys and pull them both down, like Draymond Green did in the Laker game.
Sure.
We'll see. But again, the NBA season is heating up, right? We had the great stretch of Christmas games, and hopefully we continue to have some more games as we get through the NBA season. We get into, the January, February stretch, right, where you get all the trade rumors, and we'll talk about those as they come up. But we appreciate all the support. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you leave a comment, we will read it at the beginning of the video. We'll see you next episode.